Hello, welcome to another episode of the Hidden Her Story podcast. And my special guest today is Ewen Moore, who is a composer and a musician who has written a musical about a 1960s actress called Carol White. And a lot of you may be thinking, maybe know the name, or maybe don't. But today, Ewan is going to tell us all about Carol and her story, and it's one that I'm really looking forward to learning a lot more about, because I know a little bit about her and I have seen her films, but I don't really know very much about her life. So Ewan today is going to tell us a lot more about Carol and the musical that he's written, and we're going to find out, yeah, what it, how you write a story about a woman when it's not in a book, when it's in musical form. So welcome, Ewan. Ewan, thank you for talking
Thank
to us
you for
today. I'm going to
inviting me.
let you have the floor now. So please tell us more about yourself, and what you do.
Oh, well, thank you, Chrissy. Yeah, my name is Ewen Moore. I am a writer and composer and songwriter with a particular interest and passion for musical theatre, for using songs in dramatic context to explore characters and situations. It's something I've always done. I've been told that as a child I made up musicals in the school playground, stuff like that. It just seemed to me a completely natural form of expression. That said, it's a completely crazy thing to want to do as a career because there's almost nobody in the country. You know, people think it's hard enough to be a novelist or an actor, but compared with those kind of things, there's a tiny handful of people who make their actual living writing musical theatre. Um, so you only really do it when you love it. But yeah, I love doing it, and
So
I've written things over the years.
do you do this as a full-time job, or is this something that you do as a hobby around, another day job?
No, I don't do it as a full time job. I wish. Yeah, I've spent most of my professional career working part time in community learning and heritage organisations,
Wow.
museums, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So engaging families and community groups and getting them to respond creatively or in interesting ways with activities and so on with collections or buildings or interesting places. Um, I've deliberately only ever done that like 3 or 4 days a week to mean that I have time to do creativity as well and combine those two things. But yeah, no, I've never managed to actually make it.
Well, I'd just like to say that I think actually, I'm one of those people that in my 50s, I used to be a teacher, and I sort of realized that I wasn't really happy what I was doing. And then I went out and kind of made a lot of my hobbies into things that I could earn money from. But unfortunately, some of those things, because I was earning money from, stopped being fun. But I think it's wonderful that, through your work, you're bringing sort of creativity, history, you're getting people involved in it. And I think that's something that is absolutely fantastic. But a lot of people our age are realizing, I think, that there's things we want to do in life, and being creative. If you're that sort of person, if you want to write a book, if you want to write a musical, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, but you get to a certain age in life and you realize that maybe you didn't have that confidence when you were younger, but you begin to realize as you're older that nobody has that confidence. You have to build that. And if you want to do something creative and create, write a book or write a musical, you just have to have that self-belief that you can do it and go and do it. And I think it's marvelous that you've written this musical about Carol. Because I love musicals. I was brought up, my family, my mum and dad loved going to the cinema. They loved all the Hollywood musicals. And as a kid in the late 60s, early 70s, I could be found sat watching all the classics every time I was off on school holiday, and I love those musicals. And the songs were memorable, the tunes stuck in your head. You could hum them afterwards, and there's so many iconic ones. And when I went to listen to yours, the songs that you'd written for the Battersea Bardot, the musical you've written about Carol, immediately I started listening to the songs, and within a few bars I knew where the music was going, and I was singing along with the chorus, and straight away I thought, wow, these are brilliant songs. And afterwards the Battersea Bardot song was just going around in my head like a little earworm, and I thought,
So
yeah,
good to
this is what happens when you go to a musical and you go to a theatre, and what, maybe one song or a couple of songs will just resonate with you, and you go home singing them, and that means, to me, that the songwriter's done a good job. But I also enjoyed, learning Carol's story from the lyrics, so it's not just about the melody and whether it's memorable. Telling a story about somebody through their lyrics, through your lyrics, you have to find those memorable points in that person's life, and then compose a song around it and fit the mood as well. So that's something I'd really like to, perhaps first I'd like to talk about that later, but first maybe we should talk about Carol, really, because the subject of your musical, all I know about her is that she was an actress in the 60s, and she starred in, I think it was the TV series, was it, of a couple of Nell Dunn plays. And for those people who don't know theatre, being an ex-drama teacher, I will just explain to you that in the 50s, 60s, theatre had a big revolution, and there were a lot of kind of like there were angry young men and angry young women who wanted to portray more gritty kind of scenarios on stage, rather than the Edwardian comedy or the traditional types of theatre. So in the 60s there were written a lot of plays and books that kind of tackled a more working class, had a more working class hero, for those people who don't remember that. I mean, I think John Osborne the Angry was the primeval angry young man who wanted to, he was from a working class background. So drama and theatre changed quite, in lots of ways in the 1950s. So in the 1960s, TV kind of did the same thing, didn't it, Ewan? And I remember, only when I was a child, but I remember, we had all this sort of like happy, nice sort of Saturday evening variety TV that was gentle, and all these comedies, and then all of a sudden, you'd get some quite hard-hitting, well, more hard-hitting drama than we'd ever had, in between your Sunday serials like the Oneidin Line. There would be something a little bit more gritty. Maybe it was a police drama, but it showed more real life, and it was based more in a working class area, and dealing with issues that everyday people, and the ones to do with women, were kind of, they were concentrating on things like abortion. They were homelessness, things that women, we didn't talk about back in those days, and they were dangerous subjects. And there were playwrights like Nell Dunn who decided to write plays about women as well. Women weren't in the forefront in the 60s, really. The feminist revolution hadn't happened yet. So here was this actress, Carol, all of a sudden gets a role in one of these plays. And Carol's background, she came from a working class background, but I think you need to just fill us in now, because you know all the wonderful details about her. So please tell me more about Carol, because I know a bit about the plays, but let's see how she fits in with that swinging 60s London scenario, and women in film.
Carol, Carol White. She was born on the 1st of April 1943 in Hammersmith in West London. So she was born quite a long way into the Second World War, but very much into that London that was pretty down on its knees by being battered by the Second World War. She was working class. Her father owned a junkyard, basically. He was an ex-performer. He's someone who had been in the musicals, been doing maybe like what you term now stand-up comedy, had a double act with a man called Tommy Trinder, which nowadays probably most people have not heard of, but
the youngsters won't have heard, but us sort of baby boomers and yes, would probably remember Tommy. He was a very famous comedian. So Carol did come from a theatrical background then. She wasn't just sort of thrust into this. She did have that kind of that background.
She had that background, but also, like a lot of people who become kind of child stars because she became an actress very early. She had a parent who had that burning desire, but whose career had been thwarted.
Right.
And for kind of a lot of that was then placed. He put it onto his children, like, well, I didn't quite make it, and I've ended up.
It's that pushy stage parent thing that like every kid does not want to have, do they? You know, my daughter was like that. My daughter won a scholarship to a drama thing for a year, and she was very good at it. But you know, I think she just said to me, please don't be that parent that, like, you know, believes I can be the next Meryl Streep, because you know I'm doing this for fun. But a lot of parents who haven't maybe had that opportunity, or you know, didn't get that fame, I you know, it's one of those sort of things in show business, isn't it, that a lot of people, you know, had parents behind them that pushed them relentlessly, otherwise they wouldn't have got into. I think Fred and Adele Astaire, for instance, were, you know, two people whose mother just pushed them into dance classes and got them out there. So I can see, yes, so Carol came from that background, and her father had that experience. He just hadn't quite got where he wanted.
Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely it. And she was, because she lived in Hammersmith, quite near Hammersmith in Chiswick, which is just down the road from Hammersmith, was a stage school called the Corona Stage School, which was quite a well-known stage school at that time. And if you look it up online, the list of alumni from that school who went on to be famous actors is huge. There's a lot of names. And so they'd heard of this school. And of course, Carol and her younger sister, Jane, were like, can we go? Can we go? And they auditioned for the school, and they got accepted and enrolled in the school. So in a stage school at that time like that, you were kind of half doing normal lessons and half doing things that related to theatre and performance. And film companies would come to stage schools like that when they needed children to be in films.
Right.
So that would be like the kind of port of call for, oh, there's an audition coming up, and children from the school get put up for the audition. But also because her dad was really pushy, he would, you know, all through the summer holidays, he would take Carol and her sister down to various seaside resorts around the south coast of Britain and get them to take part in talent contests. So for most people enrolling in these talent contests, it was just a bit of fun. But Carol's dad was, no, you've got to practice. You've got to practice on your poise. You've got to practice on your singing, on your posture, your delivery. And Carol found that she started winning these contests. And as soon as she started winning them, she'd probably be about 12, 13 years old. Her dad would be like, right, there's one on in Margate this weekend, there's one on in Worthing the following weekend, whatever. And he would take them every weekend round to these contests, and she kept winning these contests. So kind of what happened, I feel, is that she got several things. She got a thirst for success and attention, particularly male attention. But as she started to learn how to pose for the camera, but she also started to equate being successful and loved and glamorous with parental approval and her father's love. And in a way, that's quite key to understanding the development of what happens to her through the years and decades afterwards. Because I think something can happen. At that age, your brain is very malleable. It's forming how it interacts with the world, how it relates to other people. And I think it really sets you in can set you in particular patterns of that age that you really struggle to break from in later life. And you see a lot of adults, and I'm no exception, everyone I know, you kind of push and pull against things in your upbringing. Obviously, there's that famous
and I totally agree. I read a lot of stories about women, and a lot of the time, you know, the actions of those women especially the infamous ones, are because perhaps they didn't have a good father figure, or, you know, your relationship you have with your parents often, you know, really does affect who you become as an adult. And being, you know, somebody who lost their father when I was fairly well at teenage years, you know, I know the effect that had on me. And now looking back at my relationships, you know, I realized, you know, when I married my first husband, who was like 10 years older than me, I was looking for a father figure, but, you know, some women don't figure that out in their lives until they're a lot older. But also, yeah, and but the relationship you have for you know, the father-daughter relationship is so vitally important. I mean, I was lucky that even though I didn't have my dad for very long, yeah, everything he taught me about history, he's the reason I love, you know, history, because he took me out to museums and he taught me, I think, everything I actually needed to know in those first 12 years before, unfortunately, he was taken from us quite young. But, you know, I look back now and think, you know, the relationship I had with my dad, it plays a huge part in the person that I've become today. So I can see how Carol would want that, her father's you know, love and attention, and then maybe would try and find that or recreate that somewhere else, and its patterns of behavior. And it's very similar. A lot of actresses, when I read the stories about actresses who have gone onto the stage, you know, this need for love because perhaps they felt they didn't get it from a parent, be it a mother or a father. You know, it plays a role in a lot of actresses' stories. So it's interesting that, you know, Carol really does kind of fit into this, that, you know, there is a group of actresses who have had these similar experiences. So Carol's experiences are shared women's experiences within the acting, you know, the acting business. But yeah, it's really interesting. Carry on, because I want to know more now.
Well, I mean, another thing that Carol herself talks about in her it is ghost-written autobiography, but her autobiography, which was published in the early 1980s, is how volatile her parents were as people, but how normal that was for her, because she just accepted that's the way things were. So I think they were incredibly dramatic, incredibly big personalities who were very popular in the local area and probably very much in love with each other, but also quite violent. She talks about how that she would sometimes come down of an evening and see them chasing each other with carving knives around the kitchen, which sounds pretty horrific and dramatic. But they had, by all accounts, they had problems with alcohol, which is something Carol herself went on to have quite catastrophically through her life. And alcoholism is something that can be inherited in a way. You pick up. I don't want to imply that it was a nightmare or that it was dark, because Carol herself talks about it incredibly fondly, about this magical world of this junkyard that her dad owned that was full of all sorts of weird and wonderful things, dressmakers, dummies, rocking horses, feather boas, stuff that she just used to dress up, and she was always performing and making up plays and creating this fantasy world that she absolutely loved. So yeah, it's complicated. And one of the things that really drew me to Carol's story and made me want to tell it as honestly as I could is that it is really, really complicated. You know, you can have very fond memories of things that you might look at as an adult and think, well, I'm not sure that's very healthy or that's very right, but they become part of your identity. And if you own your identity, as I feel Carol really did, then you're kind of owning it warts and all in a way.
I totally agree with you, and without going into too much detail, yeah, I can really, really relate to that, because, you know, every family behind closed doors, and I've researched my family history, and, you know, there's stuff that people know about in the family because it's open, but, you know, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind closed doors, and you never really know relationships, even, you know, your closest family. So I can really relate to that. And also the fact that yes, it is complicated. You know, you may have parents who are arguing, who are, you know, in a toxic relationship as a child, and you may grow up and see that, and you can either how it changes you is in the way that you respond to that. So you can either, you know, if you, especially if you're a boy and you see your father hitting your mother and being abusive, you can either realize that that's wrong and, you know, never ever do that in your own relationships, or you can copy the pattern because it's what you've known. And I know many women who have been through domestic abuse, and if you've, you know, if you've come from a family where you watched your father be abusive to your mother, if you're, I'm not saying you're more likely to end up in a relationship like that, but you're probably less likely to see the danger signs because it appears normal to you, because that's the model of relationship that you've grown up in. And people, you know, I think people find domestic abuse a difficult idea to think about if they haven't been through it themselves, because, you know, people always ask that question, why don't you leave the perpetrator, whether it's a male or a female, because it happens to both. And that question is so loaded and so complex that, you know, whenever I see that on discussions about domestic abuse on Twitter, I'm always, you know, interested to see the answers from the women, because they are so complex. And you know, if you've had that in your life in any way, shape or form, it will affect your relationships and how you develop yourself. But like I said, you know, you can either react to these things one way, you can either, you know, you can either allow yourself to keep falling into those relationships because they're patterns and habits that you've learned, or you can do something about changing, and, you know, and changing the way that you approach your relationships. And some people can manage that and other people can't. You know, and it's a really, really loaded, very complex situation, as you say. And it's difficult to understand why people do the things that they do, and why people stay in relationships that, you know, that are abusive. And that idea of, you know, love, hate, and we all have that in a relationship, don't we? But a lot of people don't understand that, you know, you can have both. You can, somebody can be really treating you really badly, but, you know, for some reason you still cling on to that love for that person. So I'm interested to hear about Carol's relationships now, and in the knowledge that, you know, she came from parents who, you know, obviously did have a toxic, you know, very toxic relationship. So please tell me more.
Yes, so Carol got her first real taste of being on the silver screen in a production made by an organisation. Again, trouble is, so many of the references in this, particularly related to Carol's early life, are things that aren't particularly well known now, but a real mainstay of British culture for several decades was this film company called the Children's Film Foundation.
Yes, I remember watching their films. Oh gosh, there used to be a program called Screen Test in the 70s, and they used to really promote the Children's Film Foundation, and I used to love watching those movies. I think the Double Deckers came out of that as well, which was Saturday morning TV for me for, you know, many years in the early 70s. So yeah, I remember that. And they did a lot about, you know, they made films with kids in, and kids produced them and acted in them, and they were a really great thing. I always sort of wondered how you ever got into that as a kid. You know, I would have loved to have done that. So yes, carry on.
So she landed the lead role in a Children's Film Foundation production called Circus Friends, which unfortunately I have never seen, and I've tried really hard. The wonderful television channel Talking Pictures TV has started re-showing Children's Film Foundation films every Saturday morning, and I look every week to see, have you dug up Circus Friends yet? But there's hundreds of them, and as far as I'm aware, the print still exists, but I've never been able to get hold of it. You can see a trailer for it on YouTube, so you can see just a few moments of Carol as a young.
I'll have to see if I can find that.
Not actually, not a trailer. I think it's the opening. It's the opening titles and the opening 2 or 3 minutes of it. And she obviously she really loved it. As a little aside, that was it was directed by a guy called Gerald Thomas and produced by a guy called Peter Rogers, who together became famous because they created the Carry On films.
Yes, I thought the name sounded familiar. Yes.
Which is Carol was in one of the early Carry On films, Carry On Teacher, which is set in a school, and she's one of the main group of children in that film. So
there you go. I've seen that film and I didn't know Carol was in it, so I've learned something new today.
That's the thing about. I mean, it's probably true for actors all over that at some point they appear in something that gets really big and it feels like they're an overnight success. But then if you look, they've got bit parts in all sorts of things beforehand, and you just you wouldn't know it because at that point they were just one of lots of young performers appearing in things. But Carol worked steadily in bit parts. She got to meet one of her absolute heroes, which was Brigitte Bardot, when Brigitte came over to appear in a British comedy film called Doctor at Sea. Carol has an unnamed part in that as one of various youngsters in it, but she describes how she was kind of overawed by this figure of Brigitte Bardot, and then gradually started talking to her, and Brigitte took her under her wing a bit and told her, amongst many things, how to get the secret of her fabulous blonde hair. She describes it as and says, "Oh, that's a secret that Brigitte and I share." Again, I'm quoting from Carol's autobiography.
And that's amazing because she did, she got to meet her kind of, her she had a great mentor, really.
Yeah.
And it was, I just think, was that how, because she had that sort of friendship, or she'd learned from Brigitte Bardot, and she sort of they were similar in looks, and is that why she was kind of nicknamed the Battersea Bardot?
I think so.
She was South London's own Brigitte Bardot, answer to Brigitte Bardot, which I think, when somebody gives you a nickname like that, you're not yourself then. I wonder if that sort of might have affected her, being compared to somebody, and for a woman being compared to somebody else, it's difficult because you want to be known on your own terms. You want Bardot to be known as the French Carol White, really, don't you?
Absolutely.
And not the other way around. But it's a compliment, but in a way sometimes it hampers people's careers when they're the next so and so, especially in acting. There's a lot of expectation on you.
I mean, she talks at one point about how another kind of 60s starlet was Julie Christie, and how Julie Christie, when Carol started to get big success, people were talking about her as the new Julie Christie, but had they all forgotten that there was a time when Julie Christie came on the scene that she was the new Carol White? But yeah, I mean, the Battersea Bardot thing, she's not even from Battersea. It's just because her first kind of thing that really, really got attention was the Nell Dunn written television drama Up the Junction, which was set in Battersea, and Carol is playing one of the leads in that, and made an impression. And some journalist presumably thought, "Oh, that's a nice alliteration. She looks a bit like Brigitte Bardot. We'll call her the Battersea Bardot." And when you get a name like that, it sticks.
It does stick, yes.
I ummed and ahed about calling the musical that because it is a bit of a misnomer. And there was in the early 90s a television drama about Carol made for Channel 4, which was also called Battersea Bardot. But it's a name that sticks, and you can't get away from that. And a name is gives you a hook to hang something on.
It does, and it's got that good alliteration. It is the perfect kind of musical name. There you go. It's up there in lights. So I'm really loving learning more about Carol. And can I just explain for those people who haven't seen Up the Junction? Now I'm having to go back, but it was basically a play written about a young girl who gets pregnant. It was quite I mean, it was very controversial at the time, because the middle class, sort of middle England attitude was that women didn't have sex before marriage, and here was this play showing a young woman being sexually active before marriage, becoming pregnant, and then having to deal with what she does with the baby. And it's where we get the saying, you're up the junction. It was a dilemma, showing a dilemma of a young woman, but actually doing it from the young woman's point of view, if I remember correctly, which was really revolutionary at the time. And that people complained, I'm sure. I can't remember if it
Oh,
was
they
being
did. I
people
mean,
complained and wrote in about this. We didn't want to see it as entertainment, did they? They
yeah.
didn't want to see a play that was focusing on a young woman's anguish, or showing a young woman actually enjoying having sex, or the aftermath of that enjoyment, and having choices about her body. And people were horrified by this play at the time, weren't they, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Today we would just kind of think, oh yeah, it's we see this on Hollyoaks every week, or Eastenders, and it's commonplace these days. But these things were not shown. These social issues, these social dilemmas and personal dilemmas were not really shown on TV.
It's like there was a real division in society, that certain things were private and behind closed doors, and certain things were for public discussion. And actually, that often meant that stuff that happened behind closed doors could actually be quite horrific. But it kind of was excused because, I mean, there really was an attitude, and it seems absolutely insane now in the world we're living in, but there really was an attitude of, well, that's that person's children, that's that person's wife. If it's behind closed doors, that's their matter, and that could excuse all manner of terrible things.
I know for a fact, that when young girls did get pregnant, families, it brought shame onto the family. I've had discussions, with my mother about attitudes in the 50s and 60s, and it's been really interesting because my mother went to school with somebody who got pregnant at 16, and this was in the sort of late 50s, just before the play was set in the 60s, so it was even more scandalous. And this young woman was at a girls, a quite academic girls grammar school, so those sorts of girls weren't expected to get into those situations. And I remember my mum telling me that this young girl who she'd been great friends with, and had visited her house on many occasions and thought she knew this girl quite well, and all of a sudden she just disappeared from the classroom just before the exams and never took her exams. And it was only years later that my mother found out at school reunion what had happened, that this particular girl had got pregnant, but actually it was because her father was abusing her. And this was all hushed up by the school. None of the other girls were told why this young woman just disappeared, and and had the baby. It was adopted, I think. But that was the kind of thing that used to happen back in those days. Whether you were a victim of abuse, or whether you got pregnant simply because you met a boy you loved and you thought he was going to marry you, and you gave in, and and you got pregnant. And a lot of girls were in this situation, and they didn't have like the birth control back then. They didn't have abortions were illegal, and women had the choice. You either had to have the baby and give it up for adoption, or keep it. And if you just whilst you were pregnant, you were probably shoved off to a maiden aunt somewhere in the darkest countryside, just like you were in Victorian times. So it was it was still a very taboo thing for a young woman who wasn't married to get pregnant back in those days. And I think Nell Dunn's plays and playing that role, with Carol playing that role, she probably would have been quite aware of many young women in her community who'd been in that same predicament. So she could understand that role very much, as she went into acting
Well,
in it.
Carol certainly felt, I believe, that the part was almost written for her, because I mean, I'm having to gloss over a lot, because
Yes.
to tell you everything that Carol did and went through, it wouldn't even vaguely be time. But by the time we reach in the mid-60s and she gets cast in Up the Junction, Carol has been to Precy very quickly, been in probably about 10 films in roles from tiny bit parts to kind of semi-leads with fairly major people, including Peter Sellers, Adam Faith, Oliver Reed, had relationships and affairs with quite a few of these people, has been engaged to an Italian pop star and then got out of the engagement, has met the man who's going to be her husband, become pregnant before being married, taken to have a backstreet abortion, the backstreet abortion to have not been a success, and Carol to have run out and decided to keep the baby and marry the father of the baby. Had a second child, felt like her career has hit the rocks, and then suddenly managed to get a new agent and started to get back into television rather than film, and seen that actually has had the good fortune to hook up with some people who are making quite groundbreaking television programs that are getting a lot of attention. And so she felt, having been through those kind of experiences by that point, and actually also quite significant, but not, quite a very sad part of her story, is she was also a victim of sexual abuse as a child from I believe an uncle who stayed with the family in between spells at a mental hospital, who was possibly, well, I don't really know about it, but certainly all of this she had gone through by the time of her late teens and the start of her 20s. And so she felt that she was playing herself in a way. She was like, I know how to play this role. And you can see that in those early performances. And one of the things that makes them so powerful, those mid-60s performances of Carol's, is that she really is mining her background and her experiences, and they're very raw. And because she's working with the director Ken Loach, who's right at the start of his career, and his approach is to make things that seem almost like documentaries, like you can't really tell whether they're fiction or not, and film them in that way, and to intercut them with interviews with real people. And because in particularly, which we'll come on to, the really big television drama, Kathy Come Home, which was the kind of the follow-up to Up the Junction, in which Carol starred, they cast Carol's own two children as the character Kathy's two children in that film. So she's really playing close to the line between reality and not.
But also, she's able to bring her kids to work, and I think that's brilliant, and yeah, how amazing that her kids got to actually be in that film with her, so she didn't have to worry about childcare.
You see the final scene of Come Home, which is a kind of feature-length television play about a woman who has two young children, and through no fault of her own, gradually finds herself becoming homeless.
And it's so relevant to, like, there's so many women out there now who are experiencing similar things. And I think for anybody to go back and watch that film again, it is relevant. It's just as relevant today to the homelessness program problem that we have, as it was in the 1960s. And it shows that, we haven't actually really come that far in tackling, the problems of homelessness. So yes, please do go watch Up the not Up the Junction, watch Up the Junction, but watch Kathy Come Home as well, because it is
absolutely. I mean, it's regularly cited still as one of the most important television programs of all time. And the final scene, which is when it was shot at Liverpool Street Station, with real passers-by going by, and Carol's playing the character of Kathy. She's sitting on a bench at the station with her 2 young children. They've got nowhere to go, and the authorities are coming to take her children away because they've deemed she's not fit now to be a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And she absolutely is screaming out, "No, give them back to me," as these people, authorities, are taking these 2 children, which are her own real children, away from her. And her anguish is absolutely real. And you see the shots of the passers-by sort of looking, but thinking what's going on, but not doing anything. It's one of the most powerful scenes I think's ever been on television. And what made Carol so amazing is, yeah, she was absolutely performing in a way that wasn't really like anyone else at that time. I mean, even some of the other things that were happening in the 1960s, like one of my absolute favorites is the film of the play Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney, which has the young Rita Tushingham in it. Something like that, for example, is incredibly powerful, but none of those things have that visceral feel that this is absolutely real as what you were seeing from those early things that Carol White was doing.
I do remember, I do vaguely remember the reactions and things, from the late sort of programs like that in the late 60s, even though I was quite young. I do remember my parents and grandparents' reactions to those programs, and they were so groundbreaking. And what Carol was doing, I think it was like a method acting, but as you say, digging into your own memories, your own experiences, in order to almost sort of regurgitate those emotions for real on the camera, those experiences that you've been through. I mean, that some actors are called great actors or actresses because they can inhabit many different characters, but there's also this brand of actor who can dig into those personal experiences, whatever they are, and create something that on screen looks so real because it is real. You are recreating, you're going through all of those feelings. When I've listened to actors talk about how they prepare for big emotional scenes, she would probably be taking herself back before that scene shot to something so that she could feel that anger or that pain or that. And that's actually something that is quite exhausting for actors to do. And so if you're in, a film, so like the films that Carol was in, it would be quite a traumatic experience for her to play these roles. She was really putting herself through the ringer and opening herself up emotionally and drawing on all of that. And you can't not go home, feeling emotionally exhausted after that as a person, because you're voluntarily putting yourself through that on screen.
Yeah.
And it obviously, and it shows, it does show.
The problem, I think, starts to come around this time for Carol, because for those, I mean, major spoiler alert, but Carol's story.
Spoiler alert, yes. Coming.
It doesn't play out maybe the way she hoped it would. Her talent, she had this real talent for delivering those kind of roles, but she was completely in love with the idea of being a movie star. And there was a third piece with Ken Loach called cinema, this time for the cinema, called Poor Cow, which is Ken Loach's first feature film. This was again written by Nell Dunn. It's another very powerful performance by Carol, but in a similar vein. But at the same time that she's making that, because she's also starting to make a name for herself, she gets she gets signed up by the film director Michael Winner to make a film called I'll Never Forget What's His Name. Now, Michael Winner is very much like the archetypal. It's kind of the low-rent British equivalent of a big Hollywood director producer type. So big cigar, big flashy car type, but very much, I don't know, there's something about the way we do things in this country that's, sometimes we try to ape those kind of American things, but we do them in a very kind of British way.
Yes, I remember you summed up Michael Winner absolutely perfectly there. I remember him very well. I think he was married to an actress who was in a Barbara Taylor Bradford adaptation of a historical drama, if I remember, and I can't remember her name, but I do remember Michael Winner very well. And the big fat cigar, he was very kind of, it was like, you know, the Englishman trying to do the Hollywood mogul. So yes, for people who don't know who Michael Winner was, Ewen's really given us a wonderful picture of this man. And yeah, and the sort of things he produced were kind of quite, you know, 70s sort of kitsch stuff that were a bit tongue-in-cheek, weren't they, sometimes?
Very well, shall we say, maybe.
Yeah, very popular culture.
And these two films were being made simultaneously. Ken Loach with his We'll All Muck In Together, semi-improvised, almost no budget, standing around in muddy fields in the rain. And Michael Winner with I'll Send a Limo for You, you'll have your own private trailer, it'll be full of roses and champagne. You can't blame her. This is a working class girl who wanted to be a film star, and she's suddenly being given the film star treatment.
And this is so familiar in so many stories from, you know, silent movie stars, theatre. If you come from a background and you are not used to, you know, stepping up into this world of limousines, champagne, people, you know, smart restaurants, it in most of these women's stories, it's, you know, you're being taken out of your comfort zone, and you have to learn how to behave, how to talk, how to, you know, be in this new group of people that you're now working with. And, you know, if you don't behave in certain ways and you don't do certain things, you know, you could maybe not get work offers. And, you know, things like the casting couch and stuff were there, but also, you know, but this lifestyle, it and you know, it makes you feel like you're glamorous. It makes you feel like you've made it if, you know, someone's sending a limo to you. So you can see that if you're not used to that, it would, you know, it could quickly turn anybody's head, whether they're, you know, male or female, young actors as well, not just women. It's not just a thing of, oh, you know, I'm a woman, so I'm just going to enjoy, you know, the champagne and the party lifestyle. And it does, you know, if you've got a problem with alcohol, again, it's very difficult to avoid that if you're in this sort of, you know, atmosphere all the time, and you're in the public eye, and you've got to behave, and, you know, but maybe you're nervous, so you have a couple of drinks of champagne more than you know, a couple of more glasses than you would, because you're nervous, you don't feel comfortable with these people. But it, you know, but it also dazzles you as well, the glamour of it all. It's not what you're used to, and, you know, it's nice. It's it makes you feel good about yourself.
And Carol was very determined. She was very single-minded. You know, in Michael Winner reports, because I did as much kind of bits of research as I could for writing this piece, and you sort of, I'd find myself standing in bookshops thinking, right, oh, Carol worked with this person once. I'll flick through their biography, see if there's any mention of Carol in it. Michael Winner reports how Carol stormed into his office and said, I'm going to do your film as well as Ken's, and if Ken doesn't like it, I'll go and tell that beep 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 where to go. You know, she was fiery, determined, not afraid of confrontation, and quite single-minded in what she wanted. The problem started to come when she started to find out that what she thought she wanted wasn't actually maybe quite what she thought it was. And also that she found herself in a world which was very manipulative and very misogynistic. And there were a lot of things that were right for the men that weren't all right for the women. And we have to remember as well, I mean, these things still absolutely exist, but Carol's right at the vanguard of being a working class London girl reaching these kind of positions within the entertainment industry. So it's around this time she gets a Hollywood contract. And at the same time, she's being courted for another British film by, I think, Ken Russell this time, an adaptation.
Another very, another controversial director, wasn't he, Ken Russell? But a big name for her to be, to be working with of his time.
She turned down Ken Russell and she chose Hollywood because Hollywood was where you went if you wanted to be a film star.
That's it.
The trouble was that the roles that she was offered in Hollywood didn't play to her strengths. I mean, you can't get less like a Hollywood film than something like Kathy Come Home. She's in her element in something like that.
Yeah.
In a Hollywood film, she complains about the fact that you sit around all day while they adjust the lights and then you film 2 lines. And there's
it's almost a complete antithesis, isn't it? You've got gritty kitchen sink drama on one hand and lavish, make believe kind of Hollywood glamour fairy tale. And although I can see that, that's what you would aspire to back in those times for an actress. But it really, like you say, she would have been much better making that decision and working with Ken Russell and doing something a bit more experimental and avant-garde, rather than sort of going into this mainstream Hollywood kind of, production factory where she was just really another kind of tiny little blonde starlet from London who,
month.
Yeah.
Really.
She went from being a big fish in sort of London and to being a very small fish in a big pond in Hollywood, didn't she, really? Yeah. And I think that experience must have been, quite horrendous for her, all of a sudden to go back to being a nobody.
And she felt totally out of her depth. She felt away from home.
Yeah.
She wasn't stupid. I think she could tell that what she was working on wasn't a particularly great film. And having been courted by this big shot Hollywood producer who seduces her and takes her off to a hotel in Italy for them to have this kind of idyllic weekend together, and she signs the Hollywood contract, and he does things like buy her a Mercedes and a fur coat and stuff. And she discovers that he's married, and not only is he married, but his wife has found out that he's there with Carol and has threatened to commit suicide.
Gosh, that's quite a big, that's quite a big thing, isn't it, really?
I mean, talking about it now is making me sitting here thinking, you wrote a musical about this?
That's the thing, men did behave like that. Let's go back to the 60s. To put it into context, that was what women in the film industry really had to deal with. I've read so many autobiographies of famous actresses who, they don't sometimes mention names, but the casting couch was a real thing. If you wanted to get a good move, if you were an actress and you wanted to get a good role in a film, you would play up to the director, the producer, whoever was kind of flirting with you. If that's what it took to get that role, women were expected to do that, whether they wanted to do it or not. It was that was how you got those roles. And if you told a director you weren't going to sleep with him, you weren't going to go away for the weekend, you probably wouldn't get those roles. So you had to do it. And I think a lot of women felt really they didn't like doing it, but as you say, they like the attention. If you get a holiday and a Mercedes out of it, you kind of think, well, maybe this is, I can't do anything about it, but I'll just accept that. And I think a lot of actresses did. And nowadays, with the Harvey Weinstein thing, women speak out about it, and it, hopefully it's being erased now. But Carol would have had to have done that. I think she would have felt she had to do that in order to get better roles and get more well known.
It's not even really a choice. It's that I think that for one thing, basically everything apart from, ironically, the really successful stuff with Neil Dunn, Ken Loach, etc., in her career had been built upon her her ability, kind of tragically honed in childhood to sell her sex appeal.
Yep.
In 16 years old, she gets her first major role in a little remembered British crime drama called Never Let Go.
Mm-hmm.
She's starring with Adam Faith, who's about her age, and two older men, Richard Todd and Peter Sellers. Obviously, Peter Sellers is a particularly big name.
Yep.
She has by her own admission, she has affairs with all three of them, and enjoys, at least at that time, she says, her well, I don't even know if enjoys is the word. It's just what it is.
Mm-hmm.
She wants to be an actress, and this is how the world operates. And she's aware. We've had things, I mean, not even just in acting. We've had things like the Profumo affair. Yeah. She's been aware of underworld activities going on in London, corruption in the police, things like that. Basically, she has twigged and realised that to be a success in this world, you've got to play these games, because everybody who is successful is playing these games, and people might not know about it and people might not realize it, but everyone, male or female, in a position of power, the way she sees it, I think, is playing these games, and this is what you do to be a success.
Yes, I mean, as you say, the Profumo scandal was one of the biggest, sex scandals between, for politics. In the 60s and for a long time, and people were still talking about it when I was sort of growing up in the 60s and the 70s, and it was one of the biggest scandals ever. But it kind of encapsulated everything that was going on, as you say, in that time, with the way that women were viewed sexually, the way that men and power, and the way that the world worked in that time. That's the context of what Carol was sort of having to go up against, wasn't it, in her career, in her life, and generally not just Carol, but all women really were having to battle that in whatever jobs, whether they were in a Hollywood actress, or working on Dagenham's Ford. People were fighting for better rights for women. People began to wake up that women actually weren't being treated very well in lots of different jobs, let alone the film industry. So it kind of just puts that into perspective, I think, for people a lot more. But the whole sex symbol thing as well, that was you if you were a woman, a female actress, you either had two choices. If you were a young woman and you were pretty and you were attractive and you had a good figure, you became the starlet. If you weren't that sort of woman, you weren't that sort of girl, and you maybe were a bit kooky, or you weren't classically beautiful, you went down the comedy route, and then you waited until you got a lot older, and then you took character roles. And I think that was the experience of most actresses, but there were so many of these starlets. I can think of like Sabrina, Diana Dawes. There were so many of these young blonde, very beautiful, very sexy, very curvy women who were being kind of promoted as this is the female ideal of the 60s. Like Marilyn Monroe was the most iconic, but there were so many actresses who were kind of pushed into that mold and promoted by the film companies and the studios as that type of woman. That's what women were supposed to be like and look like. And if you didn't, then it was you didn't get those roles. So
absolutely. So Carol finds herself in Hollywood. It's not going well. She starts to have a relationship with her co-star, an actor called Paul Burke, who also happens to be married, also happens to have an alcohol problem, also happens to have a severe gambling problem. Now, Carol's been paid a lot of money at this point. She because she's been Flavour of the Month, she's done things like adverts and stuff that have got a lot of money, and she's just landed a major Hollywood contract. She earns, I don't know how many million in the space of a year, and then goes through it all pretty much within the space of the next year, largely by all accounts helping to fund Paul's gambling addiction. She's having these volatile relationships, unfortunately, the relationships are getting more column inches than the films.
And well, and again, it's like, you know, that old adage that no publicity is bad publicity, but it is if your personal life and your relationships are being splashed all over the press. You know, I just imagine you don't want people knowing that sort of stuff, you know, but you're in the public eye, so there's that argument that, you know, if the journalists are going to be looking for that story if you're that woman. And that must have been an awful time for her, being hounded by journalists and seeing these stories in the press about her relationships. It's, you know,
and
it's not a pleasant thing to go through.
Although they say no publicity is bad publicity, it certainly is if you're also at a point where, through no fault of your own, the work you're doing isn't getting a lot of acclaim. I mean, the best that can be said about several of Carol's films about that time is she's miscast. You know, they're trying to place her as this kind of semi-glamorous, swinging 60s British chick. But she is, that isn't who she is. That isn't how she acts. That doesn't play to her strengths. Even though she's got the blonde hair and she's glamorous, she isn't that. And pretty quickly, Hollywood decides she's toxic and her contract's cancelled. And I mean, like, the men, not that I want to make it an entirely sexist story, but the men can get away with this stuff, you know, like, he acted with Oliver Reed a few times by then. There's no one bigger Hellraiser than Oliver Reed, but Oliver Reed has said, like, well, actually, you know, you thought I was wild. Carol White was twice as wild as I was. But you know, Oliver Reed can be lauded.
But this is how women have been treated in society, and it's, you know, women aren't meant to enjoy sex, be, you know, heavy drinkers or be able to drink men under the table, and but men it's seen as masculine behaviour. So, you know, it's the film world kind of echoes all of those things within society where women have been told it's not, you know, ladylike to be like that, and men have been getting away with all of this stuff for years, haven't they? So she's really had a lot to, you know, to cope with, hasn't she, poor old Carol, really? Like,
and she basically, it all fell apart for her, and she came back to London, not permanently, because she kind of never, I think, felt she could come home. Really, she was still trying to hold on to that Hollywood dream.
And you would, because if you gave it all up, what have you got to come back to? You think you've failed.
Like with your tail between your legs.
It's really hard to do.
She attempts suicide, and it's only one of several suicide attempts she makes through her life from that point on, and she has continuing problems with relationships, continuing problems with drink. She makes some very interesting but not commercially successful films in the early 1970s, and she basically gradually starts to fade from view as there's always new performers waiting in the wings, and she's seen as maybe volatile or unreliable, and she's starting to develop mental health problems, and really it's all just gradually it winds down and stops, to be honest with you.
And that is a devastating thing for somebody who's been creative and been in that environment since she was a young child. You know, for all of that to suddenly stop and be sort of, you know, trickle away from her after having, you know, working with all of these wonderful actors and directors and doing everything she's done. And I think a lot of people, you know, a lot of actors find that period of their life difficult to deal with, because you don't know, you know, you can't go back to just being normal. You can't go back to leading a normal life once you've experienced that. It's incredibly difficult. So where do you go? You know, what do you do with your life? You can't just go and get a job in a bank or in a shop, or you know. And if you haven't, like, if she'd spent a lot of the money that she'd earned, you know, paying off her um partner or husband's gambling debts, then you know she couldn't sort of invest that in a business or anything. She, you know, she had nothing. And I think that's to come from being up there, your name in lights, you know, to nothing. I think people, unless people have actually experienced that in their lives, a big fall from grace, where you know you end up with nothing. There is only one, you know, two ways you can go. You can either pick yourself up and try and, you know, get yourself back on track, or you end up taking your own life, or you know, you get to that point where you feel like you failed at everything. And I can really, you know, I can understand how Carol felt about that. And you know, maybe some people wouldn't, because their attitude would be again to react and, you know, well, pick themselves up and go off and do something else. But a lot of people can't. And a
Yeah.
lot of people, you know, who suffer from mental health problems, who, you know, because of they've lost their home, or they've lost things that are really important to them, whether it's a career or, yeah, the way that it affects you, you do feel like you've lost everything. So what is the point of carrying on?
Yeah.
And it's not, you know, it's people don't make that decision to take their own lives on a whim and a prayer, most of the time. You know, there is some deep-seated
Yeah.
anxiety, or you know, feeling within yourself that life would be better off if, you know, the planet, your family would be better off if you weren't in it.
Yeah.
And I think that's very difficult for a lot of people to comprehend if they haven't, you know, felt that or had an experience of that with a relative, or you know, somebody they've known. And a lot of the time people are, when we hear of like celebrities taking their own lives, we sort of think, well, but they had everything, you know, why would you, why, if you have everything, why would you do that? But they don't realize, well, once that fame goes, once the money's gone, once that adulation's gone, once you're, you know, not being given those roles, you would feel that you had, you know, it's over. So what is
I
there
think
for you?
I think what was particularly tragic about Carol's situation is because she has a couple of failed suicide attempts.
Mhm.
There's almost that feeling of I can't even do that right.
Yes, 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 and that
Um,
is a very familiar thing with people who
and
suffer from depression.
she's basically she's basically lost, and there are sporadic jobs. There's a film from 1977 called The Squeeze,
Mhm.
which is a British crime drama, which was her first film in 3 or 4 years, and it shows what she could have gone on to do if the cards had fallen slightly differently.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, it's quite a harrowing film, and the role she plays a kidnap victim in the film who is in a particularly traumatic scene. She's very good at traumatic scenes. She's forced to strip naked by her captors, and there's nothing kind of glamorous or erotic about it. She's by this time she's in her mid-30s, but she looks older
Mhm.
through everything that she's been through, and she looks vulnerable, and she looks like a real person's body, not a film star's body, if you know what I
Yes,
mean.
yes.
Now, I mean, you can look at this role and this scene in different ways. You know, it is quite voyeuristic, and it's not an easy watch, and it's is it exploitative? Isn't it exploitative? I mean, that's a whole other question that can be argued both ways. But one thing that's undeniable is she's still got it. The ability to play somebody whose world, and and because this is her lived experience, somebody to play somebody who's very vulnerable, whose world is collapsing around them, and actually like make you go, oh my goodness, that performance is coming out of the screen. It's you're feeling it, and it's uncomfortable.
Mm. But
But
that's what makes it, you know,
she's still got it.
yes.
That ability to perform those roles. Then Tracy very quickly, couple of bit parts in episodes of like American sitcoms and TV dramas,
Mhm.
one-off episodes. Then there's the most tragic part, I think, of her story, early 1980s. So she's coming up to around her 40th birthday by this point, hasn't worked for me. The Squeeze is 77, hasn't done any major work at all up to this point, 82, 83. So it's like, God, you'd think you're not going to get another chance by this point.
Mm-hmm.
But Nell Dunn has a play that she's written called Steaming on in the West End, and it's time for a cast change. And I was lucky enough to talk to Nell in researching this, and I tried to find out how this came about, but she couldn't really remember. She couldn't give me a really clear answer. But the director of the play was someone who had worked on those films in the 60s as an assistant or one of the roles in it. So obviously between the director and Nell, they'd remembered Carol, and when it was time for a cast change, one of them had obviously said, I think Carol White would be amazing for this role. Now the tragic that Carol is living in LA. She's basically bankrupt by this point. As I say, hasn't worked in years. And she's offered this role on the West End stage. And of course, she takes the role. But it all goes very, very badly wrong for her. And I think it's kind of easy to understand why, because I mean, other than her early training, she was a film actress, not a theatre actress. It's quite a different discipline, even in terms of having to screw up your courage and go out in front of people. One of the things about film is the audience aren't there. You never see them. You've got to go out in front of hundreds of people every night in the West End stage in London. It doesn't get much bigger than that. And you must be feeling that, well, this is the only option I've got at this point, and this amazing opportunity has come, but am I really up to it? Can I do it? It doesn't help that she's on to husband number 3 by this point, who by all accounts was an absolutely horrible man, who was violent and manipulative and was trying to take control of her career as her, in inverted commas, manager. But knew nothing about show business at all, and was alienating people left, right, and centre on her behalf. And she's over here in London. She's appearing in this play, and she gets one more film offer this time as well, which is a completely forgotten film with Joan Collins called Nutcracker, which is filming during the day when she's appearing on stage at night, and she can't cope with both things, and she basically has a semi-breakdown again, starts missing performances, and unfortunately fairly quickly gets fired from her role in the play. Meanwhile, Nutcracker comes out, completely disappears, gets no attention, totally forgettable film, and she and her third husband Mike leave London back to America, by all accounts, leaving behind a rented apartment full of smashed doors and broken mirrors and goodness knows what has been going on there. And she never works again. Luckily, she manages to leave Mike. But, she has this final opportunity for maybe something, but it's more than she can handle by that point. It's too late for her to really have that comeback. And yeah, she lives for another 8 or so years, basically homeless, ironically living in kind of occasional rented rooms, trying to get this film made, trying to, have this pipe dream, this idea, but basically slowly drinking herself to death, and then finally gives out, age 48 in 1991. And final tragic ending is she wants to be buried next to her parents in Mortlake Cemetery in London, but she has no money. There isn't the money to fly the body home, so she's cremated in Florida, where she's living at that point, and her ashes are posted home, and her ashes are next to her parents in Mortlake Cemetery, but there's nothing on the grave to say Carol White is there. It's basically anonymous, and
that's such a sad sort of ending for somebody who was so much in the public eye, you know, in her time. Which is, I really want to get round to asking you about the musical before we have to finish. So it's kind of fitting that I think, you know, what I've discovered with these hidden her stories is that when these women, whatever they've done, and Carol, you know, achieved a lot in the world of 60s cinema, her achievements, you know, deserve to be noted. And the fact that, you know, somehow she's sort of been wiped out of the history books, people don't remember her. The fact that you've written this musical, you know, that this is bringing Carol's story back. And I think it's really important, however people do this, whether women have been written out of history for whatever reason, for whatever, you know, sphere they've been in. There are so many people out there now writing books, you know, doing podcasts, making films, writing musicals. It's fantastic, because in a way that is, you know, that's Carol's legacy. So how did you, you know, obviously you must have done a huge amount of research, and you obviously know Carol's story, you know, so well, because you've told us so much about it. But how did you approach writing a musical about her life? So what were there sort of, you know, the idea for the songs, did they come from key moments in her life, or from interviews or things? Did you just sort of pick up on lines? And how did you create the songs that told her story? That's I'm so interested to know.
It was a long and difficult process, I have to say. This is the first time I've ever written a musical based on real life. It's the first time I've written a musical in which the central character is very, very different to me. I mean, Carol, in many ways, couldn't be more opposite to who I am. None more so than the fact she's been described by family members as someone who loved to be at the center of attention and loved drama and conflict, and would often stir things up and create dramatic situations so everyone was going into each other, and then stand back and be like, oh, look what I've created. You know, I'm a complete opposite. I can't bear conflict or dramatic situations. I like things to be nice and peaceful, and you know, I'm not a working class woman born in 1943 in London, you know, so it was a challenge, and finding her voice was one of the biggest challenges. And I think what happened is, over time, I realized that I can't write her voice, because I can't talk to her, I can't meet her, I can't know her. I can watch her act, but I can watch act roles that I like quite close to her own experience. But those are words written by somebody else. I can't know her. I talked to people who did know her. A lot of people, I tried to approach quite a few people I didn't hear from, but there were a couple of key people who were happy to talk to me. And I realized that I have to, if I'm creating a piece of theatre that stands alone and is something that is satisfying to watch, whether or not you know anything about who Carol White was, then I can't write her. I have to write a character that feels like how I imagine she would have been. Mm-hmm. And that's quite an important distinction. So I don't, in a weird way, I feel like my musical isn't really about Carol White. It is, but it's about an idea of who Carol White might have been. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then another big challenge, and this is why I think I may never write a biographical musical again about a real person, is people's lives don't follow a neat trajectory. No. people are messy and complicated, and they go around making the same mistakes over and over again and never learning from them. Even if they feel like they've learned from them, they find themselves back in those situations again. And I think everybody does this to one degree or another. But Carol's life has so many circles in it that my original script for this show, and bearing in mind this, after a few attempts, this became a one-woman show because I felt like she had to talk directly to the audience. I started off having other characters and it just felt messy. For some reason, it didn't work. I also had in the back of my mind that this might actually stand more chance of getting on somewhere if it doesn't require a cast of hundreds of people.
Absolutely. A one-woman musical is going to be fairly cheap to produce, a lot cheaper than paying a big cast. And it was actually, I mean, I'd love to just ask, because it has actually been performed, hasn't it, the Battersea Bardot, at the British Film Institute, is that right?
Film Institute, which was quite a lucky thing to happen. It was just a one-off performance. The British Film Institute were having a season of musical films. This is 20, I have to stop and think, because of the pandemic, I can't remember.
We've lost like where we are in years. There's like about 18 months that are kind of just missing in people's lives. I had to do that. I keep thinking, was it 2020, 2021, 2019? Yeah.
So this
I appreciate that.
The director that I'd hooked up with to work on the show with at that point to really develop, I don't know, people might not know about the development of musical theatre, but one of the key stages really is to workshop a show, to get it on its feet in front of some people to see how it plays. You can't go from a script on a piece of paper to opening night.
Absolutely.
Just like that, because you can't tell until you're kind of getting it up and performing it what's actually landing the way you want it to. He'd coincidentally got a job at the time to program the events related to this season at the British Film Institute of things to do with musicals, and he was like, well, hang on, I'm directing a musical about a semi-iconic British film actress, an original British musical. Maybe the BFI would be interested in having this as an event as part of their program. And obviously they're a film place, they're not a theatre place, so they haven't really done theatre before, but they wanted these kind of peripheral events to the program. So they said yes, and we got to stage it there, which was a fantastic experience.
Did any of Carol's or the people that you had spoken to who knew her, did any of her family or any ancestors sort of come along to have a look, or did you get any reaction?
I've actually not talked directly to Carol's family.
Right.
That's quite a difficult one because it's obviously quite a sensitive issue and a sensitive story, and I wanted to tell it sensitively. Not to use the word sensitive too many times. But I knew that I had to put my interpretation on it, and I had to create my own piece. So as I said, I talked to Nell Dunn. I talked to a woman called Jean Diamond, who was Carol's agent through the time of all her big work in the 1960s. But with the internet, you can kind of go about trying to track down people's relatives. Mm-hmm. And there are certain ways I think, or I could get in touch with if I wanted to try and approach her, because she has two sons who, as far as I'm aware, are alive and well, and maybe sort of 10 years older than I am. But certainly at this point, it felt like that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. But it was kind of, I got in the audience, there was Wendy Morgan, who had played Carol in the television drama about her life. It's very hard to get people along to see things, as I'm sure you're aware. You get a lot of, oh yes, I'll come, and then you only get like maybe half the people who say they'll come, and then unfortunately the day we were doing it right there on the South Bank of London was the day that there was that terrible terror attack on London Bridge.
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah.
Which sort of shut down London quite dramatically.
Oh dear.
A lot of roads were blocked, public transport wasn't running. So that wasn't great timing from that point of view. It's definitely a struggle in terms of then of course the pandemic happened, so I've been trying to find a new home for this show now. It really needs a theatre company who are interested in taking it on, because I've kind of taken it pretty much as far as I can
right
at this point. But
I think it would be, yeah, I mean, you know, from the songs that I've heard, and people can I'm going to give you a chance to plug your website now, because we've obviously hopefully whetted people's interest in this musical, and anybody out there who loves musical theatre or wants to, you know, is interested in Carol's life, if you want to go and listen to the songs, they can listen to all the songs, can't they, or a selection of songs from the musical on your website.
Yeah, we recorded demos of 5 of the songs with the performer who played Carol in that performance at the BFI. They are demos. They were done quite quickly with the purpose of selling the show rather than like finished pieces. And there's a lot more than those 5 songs in the show. But yeah, if you go to my website, which is ewenmore.co.uk, you can hear those songs. There's a page about the musical. You can hear excerpts from other things that I've done over the years as well.
There's some interesting music on there. And what I did, I went and I just put my headphones on and I just listened to the tracks and tried to sort of visualize, you know, the actress, you know, singing the songs and visualizing these things in Carol's life that were being told. And I think it just gave me a real sort of, I would have loved to have been able to come and see the show at the BFI, but I just had to sort of use my imagination to try and imagine these scenes and how the songs would be delivered. And you know, I got really excited because I was thinking, I really do hope that, you know, somebody somewhere, a director or a theatre company, will pick up on these songs and pick up on your musical. And it, you know, it would be wonderful to see this musical on stage, I think, or done, I thought, or maybe also as a film, you know, as a just a short film, to tell Carol's like that somebody needs to do this and work with you, definitely, because it's too good. It's too good just to, you know,
conversations happening. But as always with this world, it takes a long time for conversations to actually turn into a green light of something actually literally happening. Things often take years of you know, different people showing interest, discussing it, possibilities, maybe this, maybe that, before anything actually, the moment comes when real people come in and sit down and watch something taking place. And that's just the nature of this business.
It is, but don't ever give up on it, because I really am keeping my fingers crossed that in you know, in a few years time or whatever, I might get a message from you saying, Chrissy, would you like a ticket to come and see my musical, because I'll be right up there in the front row. And I just really hope that, don't give up on it, Ewen, because I think, you know, what people don't realize until they've heard your music is that you know, you are, when I listen to it, you're a fabulous song composer, and the songs that you've written deserve to be out there. Carol's story deserves to be out there. So you know, don't give up. And I'm sure Carol would be saying to you, you know, keep on, you. She would be telling you to not give up as well, and to, you know,
is what I felt with Carol's story. This was in gestation for a long time, as most of my ideas are. I turn them over and have, you know, I've always got like 10 ideas going on, and gradually they take shape. But I felt like, for one thing, she sings, which is central for a character in a musical. The character sings to me, and it was such a wonderful opportunity to draw on all those that style of that I really love, of semi-confessional, kitchen sink, 60s female singers. Like what for example, she's not really thought of as a singer these days, but I was listening to a lot of Cilla Black's records when I was writing this. Very much that style of performing, and it really draws you into the story.
It does, and it actually reminded me when I heard when I sort of listened to the first lot of songs. I mean, during the lockdown, I used to love going to the theatre. I don't often get the chance these days, but I used to love going to live shows. And one of the things that I really sort of enjoyed during the lockdown was that a lot of the, like the National Theatre and I think the Globe and a couple of other places, was streaming these live shows. And I was quite happy sitting in my kitchen with my laptop, working out whether I was going to watch Andrew Lloyd Webber on a Friday or, the Globe on a Wednesday. But I did actually I found this wonderful play, and a musical, which I'd never ever heard of before. And I think it was called The Dress, and it was put on by the Chichester Theatre, and they streamed it online only for a very limited time. I
saw what I think you're talking about.
And the actress in that was very much a sort of a story about a working class woman. And the songs in it were kind of, she sung in a Cockney accent, which I loved. And there was and when I listened to some of your songs, the delivery was quite similar, and it just sort of took me straight back to watching this wonderful play, a musical play, The Dress, that I'd watched over lockdown. And I thought, and it goes back as well to the sort of, it also reminded me a bit of like Lionel Bart and sort of Oliver and that sort of that kind of more East End, more sort of, not highbrow kind of music, but that East End sort of Cockney musical feel. There was a feel good factor to it. There was that East End-ness of South London, a London-ness to it. For want of a better word.
Yeah, and one of the fun things about her story, although I had to, my original draft of this was like 180 pages long. Right. I had to edit so much, but because her story intersects with so many interesting people. Like Lionel Bart, you mentioned, is a key person in her story. Lionel Bart introduces her to her first husband, the father of her children. You've got Frank Sinatra in her story. You've got Warren Beatty in her story. You've got
Terence Stamp was another big actor
in her story. You've got all these interesting people as part of the cultural zeitgeist intersecting with her. And what I find particularly interesting, and this relates a lot to what I think your blog is about, is that you read something about her and all these people feature in it. You pick up, say, a biography of Frank Sinatra. Does Carol White get a mention? No, she doesn't.
No.
Her part in all these stories is written out of the stories. Even though she very nearly ended up as Mrs. Frank Sinatra at one point.
Would have been
I mentioned she doesn't. And you asked earlier on as well, which we haven't addressed, about the fact that, I'm a man writing a one-woman show about a very female subject. And, when I started doing this, I didn't even really think about that. I mean, it was probably about 10 years ago that I was starting seriously to think, could this be a subject for a show? And I was just very drawn to her as a person and the world she inhabited. I love both that kind of post-war London and its lead into the 1960s and how society changed. And then I loved the world she went into. I loved that whole kind of Hollywood, LA, early 1970s kind of, I can almost see them as two different types of film stock, that kind of gritty black and white London, and then those very overexposed, bright Technicolor, Super 8 home movies of Hollywood stars sort of sitting on lounges in the early 70s. A lot of British expats, actually, as very much she was part of that sort of hooked in with that kind of world. And so all those things really drew me to it. But over the time that I've been I worked on the show, things like the Me Too movement, they came about during that time. And it was like suddenly this story took on a huge amount of social and political resonance. And I watch documentaries now about, people like Britney Spears, for example, and you just think, but this is Carol's story. These things are still playing out just the same. The prurient interest of the press, the sexualization, the freak show aspect of when someone is having a breakdown or unable to cope with their situation. All of these things.
Everything. It's so relevant. And it's funny you mentioned the Me Too movement, because I think it was round about this time a couple of years, a few years ago. It was in October that I think the actress first, coined that Me Too phrase. I think it was coming out on this day on Twitter the other day. So, it's quite relevant that we're talking about it on the anniversary of that happening. And, my partner's into like sci-fi stuff and listens to a lot of podcasts, and at the moment, there's big things with the sci-fi movies and the Marvel and Doctor Who and everything that's going on there, and this cancel culture now, that if there's so much cancel culture around, and it does relate back to if a celebrity happens to have done something which perhaps back in the time that they did it, it probably wasn't acceptable then, but it was more of a norm, and now it's not, and these things get rehashed, and you are seeing people are losing, actors are being cancelled for things that they did or said, or and some of them, a lot of them are should be, but it's now gone beyond. It's like there's like this witch hunt now to find people who aren't who don't fit in with certain sort of views of what we find acceptable behavior. And this cancel culture is big in Hollywood. It's still the Me Too thing, the Harvey Weinstein. It's all very, very relevant, which is why I think these stories about actresses and people, who time has forgot, really, when we read those, it does remind us that this is not something that has just happened recently or is happening now. This is something that's happened for a long time, and so therefore it's ingrained within the film industry. It's ingrained within what women who go into acting have to put up with. I know actresses like Judi Dench and Helen Mirren have commented on this in the past, and these very respected actresses who have said, well, yes, it did go on and we had to do it, otherwise we wouldn't work. And so I just think that the fact that Carol's story is now being retold, whether it's in a book, whether it's in a musical, however you're choosing to tell it, and your genre is music, it's that this it needs to be done. So I want to thank you for doing something really creative, Ewen, and putting your passion, which you clearly have for your music and for your for playwriting, and particularly for your for, as you said, it's the era, and I'm in love with all of these historical eras. It's for me, it's like time traveling, going back to the 20s or the 60s when I'm researching all these different women. But it is all these women's stories are kind of being erased, and there's so many different reasons for it, in history, in popular culture, everywhere. And it never ceases to amaze me. And I tell people I find these stories every day. I mean, every single day another woman will pop into my periphery, either through something I've seen on Twitter, or I'm reading a book, and so I'm reading a book about one woman, and then another woman's name will, and I'll think, oh well, I need to go and look at what she did now. And I'll be honest with you, I've got like masses and masses of like notes and names of women who we don't know about, and I don't know about, and I buy books and I look in them and I'm like, wow, I haven't heard about this woman before. And so I'm never going to have the time to write about them all. So and I love it when I discover other people who are telling these stories in different ways. I talk to a lot of authors and writers, and that seems to be the main way of telling women's stories. But I just find it really, I've got an artist I'm talking to in a few weeks' time, and it's just so wonderful to see all of these people, male, females, who are doing things in so many different creative spheres and getting these stories out there one way or another.
It's a real, it feels like it's really important that these stories are told, and that you know, things aren't going to change or develop if these stories aren't told. And as I said, I didn't begin wanting to write a political story specifically about a woman. Carol White happened to be female, but as it's gone on, that's definitely something that has absolutely fed into it. And I do believe that while it's incredibly important for people to have their own voice and tell their own stories, it's equally important for somebody who's male to engage with these stories, because otherwise, how is anything ever going to change?
Absolutely, and it's that's the wonderful thing. I'm glad that, you know, there are guys out there like you doing that, and it's not just, you know, a body of women, you know, and it's absolutely fantastic that we, you know, we have this diversity, that men should be allowed to tell women's stories, because, you know, and you're doing it in a way that is you're looking, you know, you have portrayed Carol, you're trying to portray Carol's life as a woman in an industry where it was, you know, women were seen as sex symbols. And I think that's why I'd love to see the musical performed and to see the actress kind of putting that into words, because I think that's something I would really love to see. And I'm sure, listening to your lyrics, I think, you know, you are very sympathetic with the fact that she's a woman, and the story you are telling is from her viewpoint rather than your viewpoint of her as a woman. And that's what I liked about it.
I hope, you know, if people who did know her see it, I hope they feel that I've been respectful and that I did her justice to the complicated, fascinating, vulnerable, but also very strong person that she was. And I mean, if I would leave this with any thought, really, is that, and this is what I really wanted ultimately to bring out in the show, is however it ended, she did it.
Exactly, you know, exactly. And it's the
made a program that 12 million people were watching, talked about in Parliament. She made films as a star in Hollywood. Whatever else happened, she wanted to do that, and she did it. And you know,
that is an amazing achievement
from life, is that we get to do at least once or twice the things that we dream of doing.
Absolutely, and that is you know, it's following your dreams, isn't it? And Carol did do that, and her films are still there. I think that's you know, maybe her name is not on the gravestone and people don't know her name as well, but those films are out there. So, you know, if you're a youngster and you're doing, like, you know, film studies, and you want to, you know, we want younger people to actually appreciate those films. I know, like, my daughter did film studies, you know, and it's like, yes, come and watch these films, because they were groundbreaking. So if we can introduce a few younger, you know, blog readers and podcast listeners to go out there and watch those films, that is Carol's legacy. Seeing her and some superb acting, you know, which she did, and I think we should remember that. And obviously, if your musical gets put on again sometime, then, you know, I'm really going to hope that it's going to get the attention it deserves, just like Carol did at the time.
Thank you, Chrissy, for you know, your interest and for
well, no, it's just I came across you on Twitter. It was one of those days where I was just, you know, looking, and you posted something out about Carol, and I thought, yeah, I remember that film. And then I went and had a look, and this is how the journey starts every time when I discover a new woman or somebody that, you know, I think, yeah, no, this story, you know, needs to go on the blog. So, you know, it was just one of those serendipity that I discovered you're on this post about when Carol had passed away. I think it was last month. In remembrance of that, and then I went on a lovely little journey, and then we've been chatting, and it's been absolutely fabulous. I just can't wait. You know, I really do hope that this musical does get put on, because let's face it, after COVID, the theatres, and it's in such a terrible state, our theatrical world, and it really does need, you know, some good new material out there. So I'm just hoping that, you know, somewhere along the line, maybe there's a director or a producer out there, or I do have sort of, you know, people who I know, you know, follow me on Twitter who sort of do that sort of thing. So, you know, guys, go and have a listen to the songs. Ladies, you know, just if you can do anything to help you, and then you're in the industry or you're in the theatre, you know, and you can help or put him in contact with anybody who might be interested, just please do it, because this musical does need to be on. And I'll be there. I said I'm going to be there in the front row. If it ever does come to that, I will be there, and I'm really hoping it does. But thank you so much for giving your time today, and
lovely to talk to you.
Carol's story, because it's been fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of people now are going to go up and hopefully, like, you know, try and dig the films out or buy them on Amazon and actually watch and understand a little bit more of this fascinating lady's life. So thank you for all your knowledge about her and giving it to us today.
Blog. Hope it goes from strength to strength, and all the podcasts and everything.
Well, I think it's one of those things. I gave up on it for a bit. I started it. You know, then COVID came. I had other things and it was like one of these little projects that I thought was a really good idea at the time. Got a lot of interest, and then my life sort of impinged on it, and then COVID did. And during COVID, I wrote my first book. So I wrote my first book on my family after doing 30 years of research on my own family history, which was set sort of, well, it's my grandparents were from the East End, so it was really interesting. I've got all this research that I'd done and needed to do something with it. So during lockdown, I thought, you know, I've been putting this off 30 years. Now I'm going to do something with it. Wrote a book, which was just for my family, really, but a few people have read it and said, oh, this is brilliant. It's social history, so you should go out and do it. And then I started talking to with my mum, and she said, well, that blog you wrote was really good. So she said, I don't think you should give up on that either. And so we sort of came to the conclusion that, you know, maybe this should be my life now, sort of have a nice little part-time job, which I do, and then run the blog in the afternoon and concentrate on the writing. So, you know, it's great. I like writing these little stories of women. I've got some ideas for books, and I'm hoping that, you know, the blog is not just a place where I can promote my own books in the end, or my writing, but it's also a place where, you know, people like yourself, other authors, podcasters, I've got so many lovely guests all lined up now to talk to me. And it's just a place, I think, where anybody who's interested in women's history, or just interested in finding out, you know, stories about people they've never heard of, because it never ceases to amaze me how, you know, there are so many events and things that, you know, are not written in the history books. So there's a big trend about this now, and I think it's really good to sort of, you know, open it up and not be in competition with other people, because there's a lot of people doing blogs like mine. But we've all got our own little kind of niche, or our little, you know, things that we're concentrating on. And as I've said to quite a few people, there are quite a few, you know, women's history podcasts out there, but there's so much subject matter that we're never ever going to run out of, you know, people to talk about. There's fresh people every day. There's fresh women doing things and making history. So I think, you know, we're never going to run out of material, and there's enough room for all of us to approach these stories in our own sort of individual way, and within our own little niches, and work with all of you wonderful people out there who are telling the stories. Well, thank you, Ewen. I'm going to let you go, because we've had I might have to, I think, chop this into 2 parts. I think this podcast, we'll do part 1 and part 2. We'll do like the rides and the fall, maybe, and the after chat. But it's been amazing to speak to you. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you so
much. Everything, you know, just keep on with your music, and you know, we really do hope that this musical gets out there. So again, just plug your website. It's ewenmoore.co.uk. So guys, go and listen to the songs, support Ewen's work, and don't forget to tune in to another Hidden Her Story blog and podcast very shortly. Bye bye, Ewen. Bye bye, viewers. We'll see you all again soon. Thank you. Right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Right, we do that one. Right.